Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium, in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where the videos are available to watch anytime afterwards. And if you've not already done so, please silence your phone. The traveling exhibit Atomic Alert, Confronting the Bomb in the New Atomic Age, opens upstairs this Saturday, September 7th, and will run through November 8th. Atomic Alert delves into the history of the Federal Civil Defense Administration, which was established to prepare Americans for the dangers of the atomic age. Mississippi played a role in nuclear testing with 2 detonations near Hattiesburg, Project Salmon in 1964 and Project Sterling in 1966. So make a point to come and see that. And then on Sunday, September 8th at 2 p.m., we'll show the documentary Rising Hope here in the auditorium as part of our free monthly Sunday screening series. The film focuses on the small Delta town of Shaw and explores themes of generational poverty, racial oppression, post-NAFTA job losses, and the impact of underfunding public education. We'll be joined by director Theo Averinos and some of the people featured in the film, including the Reverend Heron Wilson, Dr. Cora Jackson, Pamela D.C. Jr., and Dr. Robert Luckett. I hope you'll come back next week for History's Lunch when Tracy McMillan will present Mississippi's Schools and the Cash Value of Racism in America. McMillan is a panelist at the Mississippi Book Festival, which will be the Saturday following her History's Lunch, and I hope that you'll all take advantage of that fantastic event right here in our backyard. Today, I'm delighted to have Elizabeth West presenting Black Migration Before the Great Migration. Here to say a few words about Dr. West is our museum educator and Mississippi Book Festival panelist for her book, Yonder Come Day, Jasmine Holmes.
Hi, friends. I know you're not here to see me, so I'm going to keep it brief. Elizabeth J. West is the Amos Distinguished Chair in English Letters and the co-director of academics of the Center of Studies on Africa and its Diaspora at Georgia State University. She is principal investigator for the 2022-25 Mellon Foundation Grant, Intersectionality in the American South, and a member of the University of Mississippi Medical Center's Asylum Hill Research Consortium. West received her PhD in English with a certificate in Women's Studies from Emory University. Her book, Finding Francis, One Family's Journey from Slavery to Freedom, won the 2023 College Language Association Book Award, and her other works include African Spirituality in Black Women's Fiction, Threaded Visions of Memory, Community, Nature, and Being, and Literary Expressions of African Spirituality as co-editor.
Okay, I just want to make sure I'm all set up before I start. I hope I don't fly through it, but I have myself timed, and the great fun in these kind of presentations for me is not me talking, but questions. So if I start to speed it up as I look up at the clock, I hope you'll forgive me, because I really want to hear from you, and I want to make sure I leave time for that. I want to mind my Mississippi and Southern manners and make sure I say thank you for those of you who are here and those virtually, and to thank Chris Goodwin for this invitation. It is really nice to come home to talk about home. So thank you. With the histories, visuals, and databases that have emerged from decades of research and digitization initiatives, we have sources that give us a much more detailed and concise look at the 4 centuries and millions of Africans forced to embark upon passage into the transatlantic slave trade. One of the most resource digitized examples of this is slavevoyages.org, which you're looking at one of their screens. It's a website that has archived databases covering voyages and people of this era of human kidnapping and trafficking. These databases provide detailed information on routes and African captives forcibly kidnapped and delivered to slave ports across the Americas and the Caribbean. Fast forward to the 20th century in the US, we find what has been called the Great Migration, a term that refers to a mass exodus of African-descended people in the US from the period of post-World War I to around the 60s and 70s. Though historical for the estimated 6 million African Americans who left the South during this more than half century, this migration was significantly shorter than the 4 centuries of the Atlantic slave trade. Where the Atlantic slave trade covered and expands from North to South America, the Great Migration of the 20th century was internal to U.S. studies, to the U.S. Studies of the Great Migration focus on the pathways or routes across the U.S. landscapes as blacks in the South, particularly the rural South, migrated to urban, especially northern, Midwestern, and Western cities in hopes of escaping the violence, economic blight, and political terror they faced in the South. This migration has been researched and pondered across academic and creative worlds. Well-known examples include Mississippi's own Richard Wright in his autobiography, Black Boy, Isabel Wilkerson's Pulitzer Prize-winning study, The Warmth of Other Suns, and as exemplified here on the screen, in the art of Jacob Lawrence, as it's captured in a recent 2017 edited collection focusing on his art. Within the 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade and preceding the 20th century migration, there lies the stretch of centuries from the 1600s to 1865 and generations where enslaved African Americans were forcibly moved and removed across the U.S. South. A movement or migration fueled by the nation's territorial confiscation of native lands. Called the domestic or internal slave trade, and by some it is called the Second Middle Passage, it was a new version of displacement that in the 50 years before the Civil War removed well over 1 million enslaved people from the upper and eastern South into the interior of the Deep South and into states like Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas. This trade grew rapidly after the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed in the U.S. Much is written, discussed, and debated about the more than 2 centuries of enslavement in colonial and the antebellum U.S. But there remains much research needed into the micro dynamic of the internal slave trade as a history of forced migration for African Americans in the U.S. South. For the most part, despite acknowledgement of the selling of African Americans in an internal trade economy, representations of blacks in the antebellum South typically conjure a language of stasis or frozen histories of place that were interrupted for individual persons at single moments in time. It invites a vision of individuals being plucked from different locations, sold in isolation to other enslavers, and then being permanently planted into new spaces. It is a picture that does not capture the dynamic experience of movement and migration for African Americans whose fates were tied to the movements of those who enslaved them, many of whom were moving several times in a single lifetime, and the experience of many African Americans who were moved as family or kinship groups along with them. Forced migration during the 19th century antebellum era had many versions, and research of these varied experiences of Black migration can offer significant insight into the DNA of African American sensibilities of place, home, and belonging. While a great percentage of enslaved people were sold as individuals and torn from their communities and families, there was also the case of enslaved people sold or forcibly moved as families or in kinship or community groups. In the case of my 19th century ancestor and the matriarchal focus of my book, Finding Francis, the experience of forced migration occurred within and across state borders within her single lifetime. The final resting place for Francis was in Mississippi, after having been transported across Georgia for the first half of her life. Francis Sistrunk was the product of the domestic slave trade. Her mother and grandmother transported into and across Georgia by enslavers from Virginia and South Carolina who entered eastern Georgia at the end of the 18th or early 19th century. And I kind of circle those points, those areas, to give you a kind of visual of that. She represents the 1 million+ enslaved African Americans who experienced a Black migration that was spawned a century before the Great Migration of the 20th century. I want to quickly give you just a sketch view of Francis, her lineage, and the likely patrilineal lines for her 6 children, 5 who were born in Harris County, Georgia, before they were forced into Mississippi. And I'll talk about this more. My connection, ancestral connection to Francis is through her son, Shadrach. Shadrach, I've been able to determine, was fathered by an enslaved person adjacent to where Francis resided in Harris County. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. What the previous sketch doesn't show is Francis's lineage, her own lineage, going back. This is an element of the work that I continue to, to research and chase. But in terms of her mother, or at least speculations about her mother, I've been able to infer a few things. And I'll start with a copy of the 1840 census in Marion County, Georgia, to explain that. So unless her mother was among the 2 adult enslaved women listed on Jacob Sr.'s 1840 census count, Francis had been separated from her mother by this point. By the time we see her on the, if you'll notice that little star there on the right side of the census, that's Francis in the house of Jacob Sistrunk Jr. Like many enslaved children separated from their mothers, Francis would have become the charge of a surrogate mother. The process was necessary and commonplace throughout enslaved communities. She represented part of an antebellum world where Black families with both parents was the dominant familial template. But again, mother-headed households were not uncommon and were central to maintaining family and kinship and community structures throughout enslavement. Francis's time in Marion County was formative. She was, as you can see by the census, she was the only enslaved person listed in the household of Jacob Sistrunk Jr., but the children in her community circle were nearby on Jacob's father's adjacent farm. This included 2 girls and 4 boys under age 10, and similarly for Francis, a child, male, who was listed in the category 10 to 24 years old. With the large range in each age category, the children under 10 would have been her playmates or even her charges to care for. The one enslaved man noted in age group 24 through 36 may have been husband to one of the 2 enslaved women in the same age group. As well, he may have been the biological father to some of the children and surrogate to those with whom he had no biological connection. This would have been the kinship world that shaped her young foundation of family and community. A few years after Jacob Sr.'s death in 1841, Francis was moved to Harris County, where her enslaver, Jacob Jr., took up residence, it appears, on land owned by a wealthy and, for that age, powerful enslaver, Seaborn Watley. He was a member of Jacob's former Watley neighbors in Marion County. In 1844, Francis gave birth to John, her oldest child of record. If Francis was born in 1827, as the 1850 and 1860 census suggests, she would have been 17 at the time of John's birth. As the earlier slide showed, with the exception of one case, the patrilineal progenitors of Francis's 6 children were probably enslavers, and probably from the Watley or Sistrunk families. In the case of her 3rd child, Shadrach, the father was, as I mentioned before, probably an enslaved man named Shadrach, who worked on the Dowdell estate around the area of the grist mill during the time Francis was enslaved in Harris County. And the mill itself was owned and operated by James Dowdell along a creek that was named by Dowdell as well. In June 1821, James Dowdell signed an affidavit signaling that he was introducing, quote, 12 Negro slaves, unquote, into the state of Georgia in the county of Jasper. He lists, quote, Shadrach, about 17 years old, among the group of 12 that, excluding the children, he identified as field hands. Dowdell was a Virginia native who had been living in Georgia since at least 1820, the year he is recorded in the census for Putnam County. Shadrach's racial paternity and his paternal family line were confirmed through the expanded narrative that can emerge from sampling DNA and ancestral accounts available through online ancestry databases and DNA tests. Drawing from 2 DNA tests taken by a second-generation male descendant of Shadrach, I was able to determine that Shadrach was not fathered by a white man. In particular, as these resources helped affirm that Shadrach's father was black, this fact revealed that as an enslaved woman and mother who had given birth to children fathered by her enslavers, Francis had at least one occasion, on at least one occasion, dared to assert her autonomy and choose a relationship and father for at least one of her children. In this world of plantation power brokers, where her enslaver Jacob was in pursuit of greater financial fortunes, Francis and Shadrach Dowdell encountered one another, and at least one child, Shadrach, was a product of the relationship that developed between them. James Dowdell held 2 enslaved men named Shadrach during the period that Francis lived in Harris County. My determination in looking at the ages was that, and again, back to the affidavit of the person I now identify as Shadrach I, and again, in knowing that both Shadrachs had families as well, is that the Shadrach who Dowdell brought in 1821 is probably the father of the Shadrach who I've now named Shadrach II to keep it from being confusing. And it's probably Shadrach II who was the father of my ancestor, Shadrach. In 1840, Daniel Watley Jr., his wife, and 5 minor children are recorded directly above Jacob Sistrunk on the Marion County census. They are neighbors. In the following year, Daniel and younger brother Willis Watley are recorded purchasing considerable numbers of items in the estate sales of Jacob Sr. In 1850, Daniel's distant cousin, Seaborn J. Watley, appears directly above Jacob Jr. on the Harris County slave schedule, 3 spaces above Jacob on the non-population schedule for agriculture, and 2 lines above him on the census of free persons. In 1860, Jacob and Daniel Watley Jr. appear on the census for Noxubee County, Mississippi. Jacob's more than 20-year proximity to Watley's and DNA evidence that ties Francis biologically to Watley's suggest that his legal possession of Francis may have occurred through some transaction with a Watley. I have yet to find a document to show that transaction. When Frances named her first son, and then later in John, and then later in 1852, when she named her 4th Willis, she may have been recording their paternal connection to the Watley line. It would also mean that not only was Frances the product of an enslaved black mother and a Watley enslaver, but that some of her children were conceived by Watley enslavers as well. On the next few slides, I want to just give you a sense of the process undertaken for determining the location of Francis and her children in Harris County. This is probably part of the work that I find most fun, finding those documents and putting pieces together, and then actually locating where people were. So in this example, you just see an image from one of the many deeds that we cataloged onto our own data spreadsheet from Harris County. And we developed the spreadsheet around the properties, around enslavers who we ascertained had the likeliest connection to Jacob Jr., Francis's enslaver, because of course that then would give us a clearer idea of where Francis herself would have been located. And so this is just one of the many. This is one of the deeds for Seaborn Watley Jr. And his lot, I think 141. And this image captures the map, but also the process of georectification that we did to approximate as closely as we could where they would have been located. So on that right image, that's the larger image of the county map of Harris County. And on the left here is a zoomed in image of that. And so what you see in those 10 squares are these lots that were owned. And again, Jacob had, from everything that I've been able to determine, Jacob did not own land himself. He appears to have been living, in fact, on Watley's land. So it was important for me to capture where Watley and where Dowdell were, because again, these were the likely locations where Francis would have encountered and known Shadrach Dowdell. And this is just another zoomed in image, magnified greater. That one shaded in block is the lot owned by Seaborn Watley. Early on, we thought this was the lot where Watley lived, and again, probably where Jacob and Francis resided, where Jacob held Francis. We found out a little different, though, and if I remember right, we made this discovery after the book was published, and that just goes to show you how the research never ends. This is another zoomed-in image of the GIS rectification of the 19th century map overlaid onto Google Maps. So while we had drawn the probable, what we thought was a probable location of Francis on lot 141, turned out to have to be reversed. And reversed because I had a team of just really ambitious and eager undergraduate and graduate students working with me. And they also demonstrated to me how research happens in all kinds of corners. I had an undergraduate who went to YouTube and Facebook, I believe, hunting down Watleys. And what she discovered was someone with a YouTube page in Harris County, Georgia, who was trying to renovate a homestead, one of the original homesteads of one of the original settlers into Harris County. And what this turned out to be was the homestead of Seaborn Watley. It is the home that he built, very probably his enslaved people built, when he first came into Harris County. And again, this would have been in the 1820s when these lands were freed up and divided for white settlers. And so this is a home today. It's one of, I think, maybe 3 or 4 original homesteads that are still standing from these early settlers. And again, in the kind of language that, in conversations that people can engender over YouTube and Facebook, we actually got invited to come and visit. We got tour of the house and the property, and it led to some amazing other on-site opportunities as well. So this is just also real quick on the right side is a fireplace that still stands today on the lot as well. I've kind of talked to a few of my historian experts at campus on my campus who suggest that it is probably one of the locations where enslaved housing was built adjacent to Watley's or near Watley's. Okay, and I just want to check my time. And then finally, on the Harris County side of this story, I just thought I'd give you a sense of the location and the range of Dowdell as well as Watley, the enslavers. In Pine Mountain in Georgia, which is one of these kind of high areas in what's really a lowlands area of the state, at the top of the mountain is this location, the highest point, and it's called Dowdell's Knob. This is also the park that later became known as Franklin Roosevelt State Park. It's the place where Roosevelt came often in Georgia for health reasons. But atop the mountain here at Dowdell's Knob, and it was, named after Dowdell. It was the brother to James, but he owned this property in the 1850s. But atop that mountain, you look down into the valley area, and between just Dowdell and Watley, you're looking at tens of thousands of acres that they owned in the mid 1800s. Mississippi became a state in 1817, and this accelerated the domestic trade, including westward migration across the South into the state, and this migration surged further with the 1830 Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. Many enslaved people at the time of the Civil War had been part of the wave of those forced to migrate with enslavers who moved into the state after the signing of this treaty, which opened up the lands ceded by the Choctaw. On the eastern edge of the state, Noxubee County was one of those areas with growth that spiked post-1830. This meant that many enslaved people in these eastern bordering counties of the state had been part of cross-state movement from the Carolinas, Georgia, and Alabama in particular. The picture that emerges from this history is one of a westward migration across the U.S. South that resulted in displacement for enslaved individuals and families that occurred across generations, but in many cases, these multiple forced movements occurred within the single lifespan of individuals. And be clear, this was not the kind of 21st century economy-driven migration and movement that we know today, where people and families are making decisions to move based on opportunities for improving their economic fortunes. These were individuals and families being forced to move with no prospect of economic or quality of life improvement. And I'll just quickly mention that the image you see here is actually just a snapshot of an image that hangs in the Noxubee post office in Macon, Mississippi. In the case of enslaved matriarch Francis Sistrunk, she and her oldest five children, they arrived in Noxubee County, Mississippi, only about 6 years before the start of the Civil War, and had only been in Noxubee County, where their enslaver had forced them to move 2 years before the end of the war in 1865. And I think it's important to point out here that I'm able to trace this movement by tracing Jacob Jr. It is during the war years that this movement happens. And while, you know, many of us think that when the war started, then freedom came for enslaved people. And what the tracing of Jacob's movements here made it, you know, clear for me that there are exceptions to this general premise. I'm able to know where Francis is because I'm following Jacob during the Civil War. Jacob is more AWOL, in fact, than he is in action. That also makes him easy to track as well because he is still being counted on tax records. So I know where Jacob is because during the war, Jacob is still claiming Francis and her children as his asset. So, I'm able to find him, in particular when he moves them to Noxubee County, where I see these accounts. Again, although generations of Sistrunks after Francis would speak of Mississippi as the place of their ancestral roots, Francis spent the first half of her life in multiple locations in Georgia, and 5 of her 6 children were born in Georgia as well. And while Francis appears to have been born in Georgia, her line of descent was either first or second generation born. At the close of the Civil War, when Francis and her 6 children found themselves free in a place that was for the most part still new to them, they then, in 1865, had to begin to imagine this as their homeland and the start of their lives as free people. So in the next 6 slides, and I'll probably move through them a little quicker than I like, but if you have questions on them, hopefully we can come back to them. I've selected a few documents from the many that I used that help give a fuller picture of Francis and her family. Here I have the images from the 1860 slave schedule in Noxubee County. And again, this would have been about 4 or 5 years or so into their move to Noxubee from Harris County. And circled above is, on the slave schedule, is Jacob Sistrunk listed as the enslaver and in possession of. So he, in 1860, he's in possession of Francis and John and Willis, and the young, still young, 5 years old, and only daughter, Lucretia. This is also, where one of these moments where you see clearly Francis and Lucretia being identified as mulatto. The bottom image is the enumeration of course, unnamed, of Shadrach and Hillman, the 2 brothers. They're both shown at the same age, although they're about a year apart. They're separate because Jacob at this point is leasing them out. So they get enumerated by the persons who actually are in possession of them. In the 1870 census, we finally see Francis and children named. While the census shows them spelling their name with an S for Sistrunk, by 1871, when we see Hillman and Harriet's marriage license, which is on the right there, we see evidence of Sistrunk family lore, and that would be my own family, where they tell the story at least every family reunion about the change in the spelling. And the family story passed down explains that at some point after emancipation, the black Sistrunks, who were still spelling their name with an S at the time, made the decision to change the spelling of their surname from S to C to circumvent the delivery of their mail to white Sistrunks, who would pre-screen the mail before handing it off to them. While the C maintains the phonetic sound, because of what else it could be associated with, it quickly eliminated the problem of white Sistrunks interfering with the mail delivery to their black Sistrunk neighbors. Here is the image from 1900 that shows the conveyance of the deeds by the brothers Hillman and Shadrach, free and clear. And this is the property they bought. A decade or so after emancipation. And this is, oops, let me go back. And this is just an image of the property on the map, showing on the map of their ownership. They were, for the most part, neighbors. Shadrach actually owned 162 acres. It's not shown on that deed acquisition, so I'm still trying to figure out where his extra 81 acres came from. This is the property they bought and then came into full and clear ownership of in 1900. The property for both of them is, well, on their property, a creek, a creek runs through, and that's the creek Dancing Rabbit Creek, which is the site, as Hillman verifies in 1890s conversation visit from a state official. Hillman verifies for the state official that the land he owned along the creek there represents the site where that 1830 treaty was signed. And then real quickly, I just always, especially if she's in the room, have to thank Lyda Gibson for pointing me to this document. That's the one I don't know that I would have come across even now. I mean, it's buried in a very thick biennial book report of the state. But it is, and especially as a descendant tied to Hillman, it's just, it's really something to read that and to hear, even though it's through, transcription, but to hear him as the voice standing there verifying the importance of this site. By 1900, Francis had passed the 1880 census, and the last official record I have found noting her alive, she is recorded as mother living in the household of her son Shadrach. She is age 53, even though the census shows her at 58. By this time, her youngest son, Robert, who had been born in Neshoba, has died. Her son Willis has left. He went to Jackson. But the 4 other children remained. Francis died during the post-Reconstruction turn to pre-war treatments of blacks that took hold throughout the South. Despite this era of intimidation and violence, she lived to see her sons, Shadrach and Hillman, become land-owning, independent farmers. John Hillman, Shadrach, and Lucretia, whose husband was a landowner as well, were married, and with the exception of Hillman, were parents. Things were tough, but they also looked promising. Education and voting were clearly priorities for them. They were able to read and write, and they sought education not only for their own children, but as records show, the brothers registering their own and neighboring children for school, they were also committed to the education of those in their community. While I found no evidence of them casting a vote in an election, the brothers were regularly registered voters. I feel certain that the success of her children who had remained in Noxubee left Francis with the vision of a certain and prosperous future for their posterity. I'm going to, because I want to make sure we have time for questions, I'm going to have to do a turbo drive here through these last images, but just to try to give you a sense of the history and the turn. Hillman ends up dying at the what was called the Mississippi Insane Asylum. in 1920. By then, both of his brothers have passed. Shadrach has, in fact, lost his land. And I didn't mention it, but my own grandfather, whose history I know from my parents, this was right around the period that my grandfather left Noxubee as well. This is the image of the jail, now library, that still stands in Noxubee. That was the holding place for 76-year-old Hillman before he was conveyed to the asylum. And I hate to skip through these, but I want to be able to take questions. And this is images of the generations of Francis who would again leave, leave Noxubee in a kind of, irony. Their lives actually flow into this thing we call the 20th century Great Migration. The seeming despairing fate of Hillman and Shadrach might make some wonder what we gain by returning to the past for stories that don't follow happy ever after templates or bring us to the familiar promise that hard work always pays off. Despite the sorrow of Shadrach and Hillman's losses, I have been heartened by this story. It reminds me that sometimes you have to live for the future, a future where you may not be present or reap rewards yourself. That is not to say that you forego the beauty you find in the moment. That is not what I think they did. When times were good, they appear to have taken it all in. But they lived with the pervasive threat to safety and life that was embedded in antebellum and Jim Crow culture. At times, you have to know that you are planting seeds that you might not see sprout. Frances and many like her did just that. In uncovering her story, I came to see more clearly the interiority of enslaved African Americans who lived multidimensional lives that until very recently were deemed unknowable. Through this amalgamation of resources, methodology, and interpretation, this research uncovered a story that was not hidden or unknown, but simply unexamined and untold. Thank you.
Raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you.
Excuse me, what was the one that was committed to the lunatic asylum? What was the so-called reason for his, did he really have a breakdown, or was this just something they made up?
Things work out so well. The fact that I can't tell you that means you got to buy the book. But to wrap it all up in a few seconds, he could have suffered some forms of a kind of mental dementia, but they were caused very likely by physical illness. Because he dies at the asylum only 3 months after he was admitted, and the cause of death, I think, is something like nephritis. The story is much more complicated than that. He is committed by a new wife. His wife of most of his life dies at around 1916, and he marries a woman that, young enough to have been his daughter, half his age, and I won't go any further than that. But it's quite a story.
I find this quite interesting because I have been trying to do the ancestral search for my family, and it gets overwhelming, and it's gone over a period of years and continues. But when I saw Black migration before the Great Migration, I guess I had something different in mind. I was thinking more about the big migration from the south to the north, and also I was wondering too about the difference in the migration or the forced migration of the native people and the enslaved people.
Yeah, and your question actually is the answer. The reason I find this study from this angle so important is because of just that. We tend to think of, when we talk about African American movement across time in the U.S., we usually think of that movement as south to north. And again, what we don't give the kind of attention that it deserves is that time in which the U.S. was, confiscating the lands of Native Americans, and then how this land was being settled and how African Americans, enslaved African Americans, were central to the settling of those lands.
So this is a contemporary question. I worked for Dr. Sistrunk at Jackson State University. She was over the English department, and I worked for her when I finished my degree. She was wonderful, great. I just wondered if you had an ancestor. She passed away not too long ago, but who worked at Jackson State in the English department.
That would have been my mother's sister.
Oh,
yeah.
really? Oh, wonderful. Beautiful,
Yeah.
Beautiful. She helped me
Yeah.
a lot.
Yeah, that was my aunt, and the real inspiration actually for this work. I started this work with a piece of paper that she copied and handed to everybody in the family, and I guess I was the one person who took the bait. Yeah.
Very quick question. Apart from the main thrust of your presentation, I was just wondering if I got you correctly. I'm not sure if I understood that you, apart of what you're saying, accurately. But my understanding was that talking about Mississippi, you correctly said that Mississippi became a state in 1817, and then it went on, and then Jackson, of course, President Jackson, evicted the Chickasaw, the Native American tribes, from Mississippi, exiled them, and in the 1830s, and the land that became available, this fertile land, was taken up by plantocracy and slaves. They imported many slaves to occupy the land. Of course, the land was very fertile, and because of its fertility, the slaves that were imported in vast numbers, they produced great wealth for Mississippi and for the plantocracy. And Mississippi became the richest state in the Union in the 1830s and 40s because of the economic productivity of the slaves. And if my understanding correctly, I think you said that migration was not, economic prosperity was not one of the reasons for migration. Did I get you correctly?
I was speaking in terms of the enslaved people. Yeah, prosperity was very clearly the inspiration for the white settlers as they occupied these, these territories that were confiscated. But no, my point was that in terms of enslaved people, there is no parallel, in terms of what we think about today as migration.
Thank you all for being here. Another fast-moving hour, and I know there are a few questions that we didn't get a chance to answer, but I bet Dr. West will be glad to talk to you about them over here, where we have copies of the book for sale.